Today's webinar is being presented by Claire Schutte, our staff psychologist at the Johnson Center for Child Health and Development. She graduated with honors from the University of Florida with a Bachelor of Science in Psychology and a minor in General Education. She completed graduate training at Florida Institute of Technology, completing a doctoral degree in clinical psychology and a master's degree in applied behavioral analysis. Dr. Schutte has treated a diverse population of children, adolescents, and adults in a variety of clinical settings, including community clinics, college counseling centers, psychiatric hospitals, private practice, and private treatment programs. She has extensive experience in the area of child and adult psychological evaluation and assessment, and recently completed a postdoctoral residency in psychological evaluation. Her graduate training led Dr. Schutte to discover an interest in helping individuals with autism and developmental disorders. She has provided individual therapy, group therapy, and social skills training to individuals on the autism spectrum, and is excited to continue helping those with autism and related disorders by providing psychological evaluations at the Johnson Center. Before we begin the presentation, please note that questions can be typed into your control panel throughout, and time permitting, they will be addressed at the end. Also, for those of you that have requested copies of the presentation, we cannot send out the slides. However, we do post recordings of all of our free webinars on the Johnson Center YouTube channel. Please search for us on YouTube and subscribe to get full access to all of our recorded webinars. Please welcome Dr. Claire Schutte.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. I'm looking forward to talking with you today on our last part of a four-part series for transitions for adolescents and young adults with autism spectrum disorders. Today is part 4 of the series, and I'm going to be talking about higher education and jobs and transitions that are related to these for young adults with autism spectrum disorders. A quick overview of what we'll be covering today. I'm going to start with discussing how to plan for higher education and jobs and what should be involved in the transition planning process for both of these topics. I'm also going to discuss how you can use assessment in the planning process, as well as for intervention planning. I'll talk about different options for higher education, as well as different job support options. Important considerations that should be made in the transition process, and just some general guidelines for creating an intervention and support plan. We are offering certificates of attendance. Here's a link here. It'll take you to a few multiple choice questions that you can fill out. I'll be showing this link again at the end, but again, we are offering certificates of attendance for this webinar, so this is where you'll need to go if you need to complete that. As I've done for the past few parts of this series, I'd like to review previous parts because all of them kind of go together and are related to what we're talking about today. So a quick recap from part 1, which was a general overview of transitions for young adults with autism spectrum disorders. I'm not going to go into specifics about the laws and state-funded services. However, if you would like to get more information on any of the parts of the series, as Nisi mentioned, we post the webinars on our YouTube channel, so you can go back and watch these webinars and review the information from them. But a quick review on some of the laws that are relevant are the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Again, this is a certain legislation that helps during the transition planning process and is available to students in high school, in public high schools. And the law states that transition-related services should be provided as part of the student's IEP program. The Americans with Disabilities Act can also provide post-high school and post-secondary support. The Vocational Rehabilitation Act is another important act to be aware of, Section 504, can also provide post-high school support to organizations that receive federal funding. A great resource if you do want to review some different laws and legislation related to transitions. I've put a link here, as well as a reference to the Life Journey Through Autism Guide. They have a great appendix at the end that has a table that gives an overview and summary of different laws. So make a look at that because it's a resource. We've discussed throughout the series that transition planning should begin early, typically around the age 14 or so. And again, if the individual is in a public school, the IDEA states that transition-related planning services should be provided as part of the individual's IEP. Part 2 of this series, we focused on independent living, which are skills and behaviors that help individuals live independently and function safely and appropriately in daily life. This is a huge area of importance during the transition process. And some examples of skills that we reviewed were things like hygiene, residential and home management, nutrition, cooking, budgeting, cleaning, transportation, daily planning, leisure, and community involvement. These are just some of the examples of skills that are related to independent living. However, there's many more, and this is an important area to focus on and to plan for with transitions. We also discussed the importance of assessment of independent living skills for intervention planning. And this is a theme that I've used throughout this series in terms of making sure to use assessment as a valuable resource during the transition planning process to gain a sense of what skills need to be targeted, what areas need support, and using that information to create a support plan as well as to monitor progress. We also talked about specific teaching strategies for teaching independent living skills and considering areas such as personal care, safety, leisure, community participation, etc., as I mentioned earlier. And then part 3 of the series, we talked about social issues that are related to transitions for young adults with autism spectrum disorders. As we all know, the transition period brings many new social demands, particularly with areas such as employment, school transitions, as well as living transitions. Again, we discussed the importance of assessment for intervention planning in the social area, how to support and teach social skills that are helpful during the transition, as well as areas that are relevant for social transitions, including peer relationships, dating and romantic relationships, new school, social demands and relationships, work and employment, living and community involvement. I'd like to touch on some of the research on education and employment for adults with autism spectrum disorders. The statistics and the research that's out there, it's not very promising at this point, but there are supports that can help young adults in the transition process, and research has shown us what's important related to this. A study that was done recently by Schutte et al. In 2012, they looked at post-secondary education and employment among young adults with autism spectrum disorders. This was published in the Journal of Pediatrics. And they used a large national sample, and what they did was compare youth with autism spectrum disorders to those with other developmental differences and disabilities. One important finding that they found was the period of the first 2 years after high school is kind of a risky period for no education or employment. So this finding pointed to the importance of transition planning before and during that period immediately after high school, and identifying that as kind of a time period of risk, um, and identifying that supports are definitely necessary during that time. The study found that overall, youth with autism were at higher risk for difficulties compared to other groups, and that certain factors were associated with best outcome, and these were the level of financial support and the level of functional skills of the individual. Another document that I'd like to touch on before we get started was from the current state of services for adults with autism. This document was completed by Peter Gerhardt in 2009 with the help of the Organization for Autism Research and the State of California Department of Developmental Services. I've also referenced this resource at the end of the presentation. It's a great resource to read through if you are working with adolescents and young adults with autism who are going to be transitioning. But what this overview noted was that the vast majority of adults with autism spectrum disorders are either unemployed or underemployed. Many adults with autism continue to live with family, and some of the greatest impediments are inadequacies with our system, as well as a public perception of adults on the spectrum being unemployable. So just to summarize those last two slides, there are support programs and legislation available. However, what we're facing is that the level and quality of support available is often limited, and the amount of resources is often limited. So we're at kind of a critical time right now in which the needs are clearly there, that we need more attention and resources allocated to young adults on the autism spectrum, especially during this transition to adulthood. A lot of times, families are forced to be creative in creating a support plan for their adolescent or adult children that's within their means and available resources. And typically, the support team or system will be provided by multiple sources, including the family, therapists that they're working with, mentors, state agencies, and school personnel. So we've gone through a background, but now I'd like to talk specifically about post-secondary education. And throughout the presentation, I've used both the terms higher education and post-secondary education, which basically mean the same thing. But what I'm referring to is schooling and education following high school. So in the book, Autism in the Transition to Adulthood by Weeman, Datlow, Smith, and Shaw, they identify some critical factors for successful transitions to higher education. Some of the things that they identify are factors including self-determination of the student, self-management of the student, technology use and knowledge, as well as internships and career activities to help prep for transition to higher education. And really what we want to consider is the overall fit of the young adult with autism and matching that with their support needs, what their unique interests are, as well as their skills, their strengths and weaknesses, and academic background and strengths, and match with an educational program. There's many potential challenges in regards to transition to higher education. The change from high school to college or higher ed is a huge change. The environment, the social demands, the level of independence needed is very significant. And these are some of the changes and challenges that many of our young adults might have to face. Um, with higher education, there's less one-on-one help from instructors typically. There's much higher expectations, again, in terms of independence and success. Oftentimes, classes have fewer tests for a higher percentage of a grade. So a full grade might be based on a midterm and a final, for example. So it's a lot more pressure to perform well with less amounts of opportunity. Higher education and colleges, they have different levels of supports compared to high school. And there's also legal differences in what information can be shared with parents. In high school, information about the students' performance and needs can be shared openly. However, after the age of 18 and when they transition to college, a lot of the responsibility falls on the young adult student, and some information isn't directly shared with parents. So there can be a challenge with that as well. Higher education often involves larger class sizes. A lot of times there's online classes as well as in-person classes. As I mentioned, more responsibility and independence is needed. Executive functioning demands increase. When I use the term executive functioning, I'm talking about skills related to time management, organization, planning ahead, study skills. These become even more important in the college environment. Life skills are also more necessary. A lot of times there's significant environmental changes, such as bigger or louder cafeterias, auditorium-sized classrooms can be overwhelming to some, as well as different transportation demands, just getting to and from campus, learning the bus system, navigating campus, walking to class, and being able to find classes can be a big change and a potential challenge. So when we're talking about planning for higher education, as I've mentioned in all of the parts of this webinar series, the planning process, you want to be proactive and start planning before the individual transitions to higher education, with those supports continuing throughout the transition and kind of fading them as necessary. But you want to make sure that you're providing the support even before the individual transitions and being proactive with that. Assessment can help identify different areas of support that are needed before the individual transitions. So when we're talking about higher education, it can be helpful to assess things like life skills, executive functioning skills such as time management, study skills, organization, and planning. It's also very important to assess the individual's interests and skills to help them determine what a good match might be for them for college. So for example, if a young adult shows a lot of interest and skills in the areas of technology, they might want to apply to programs that are related to technology, such as computer science or other related fields. So you want to do a good job in the planning process of kind of picking out what those interests and skills are and trying to create a good match. Some quick examples of some specific assessments that can help in the planning process. There's a few different interest and skills surveys and assessments that can be helpful. Two of these are the Strong Interest Inventory and the Campbell Interest and Skills Survey. Additionally, the Break-Ins Transition Skills Inventory is also useful. I touched on this one during the independent living part of this series. But the Brigance Transition Skills Inventory, it's more broad and assesses broad areas related to transitions, including interests and skills that are related to college and jobs. So that one can be a good one to include as well. But in the assessment process, you can also gather information from other sources, including teachers, parents, therapists, an interview with the student, as well as observation of them to gather information. Things that you want to consider in the planning process are things like the individual's academic skills, strengths and weaknesses, what their interests are, what their study skills are like. Again, we've talked about these here, their organization and time management, etc. Social functioning, so what are their social skills and what areas might they need support in to help them have the best outcome in college or higher education. You also want to have a good sense of their communication functioning. Do they need any assistive communication? Are there any areas related to communication that might impede their success in higher education that we can start supporting now? Are there any behavioral challenges that might come in the way of success in higher education, and how can we set up a plan to manage those? What are the sensory needs or sensitivities, and are there any accommodations, for example, that might be provided to make higher education easier? For example, taking a test in a very loud auditorium style classroom might be too overwhelming. So based on the sensory needs of the individual, they might take the test in a low distraction environment. You want to have a good sense of the independent living skills of the individual, as well as what their stress management is like, and what skills they have related to stress management. Because this is such a significant change, you want to make sure that they have some good coping skills for when there might be periods of overwhelm. So based on the results of your assessment and all of the information that you gather from relevant sources, as well as the unique needs and interests of the student and kind of your overall transition plan, you're going to create a support plan for planning the transition to higher education and what specific supports and accommodations are needed based on the individual. As part of this, you want to be aware of specific deadlines and create a timeline for yourself. Higher education and colleges involve a lot of specific dates and timing in terms of when applications are due and when certain important testing is due, for example. So you want to make sure that you're including that as part of the plan. Once you start researching programs, it's important to gather information from a variety of different sources. This might be from the internet, from different college or vocational resource books, as well as campus visits to campuses that the student might be interested in. It can be really helpful for the individual to be able to interview current students regarding their experiences. This could be with the student alone with other students or with a parent and the student, whatever they're most comfortable with, just to get a sense of what current students' experiences have been. It's helpful if you can to keep a log of each program that you're considering and including kind of the pros and cons so that you can go back and clearly compare the different programs that you're looking at. And again, I'd like to emphasize that the student or the young adult should really play a key role in the process of researching programs and sharing what they like, what they don't like, and just playing a key role in the process. You also want to consider planning for applications and different standardized tests that are necessary. such as providing practice with filling out college applications. A lot of times essays and letters of recommendation are necessary as part of the application. So reviewing these and planning for these and practicing them is needed. There can also be prep for different entrance exams that are necessary, such as the SAT and the ACT. A lot of times in high school, the PSAT or the practice SAT can be taken, which can be great practice and expose the young adult to the test before they actually take it. Make sure if the student does need any accommodations with the testing that the right forms are submitted so that they can have accommodations for the testing, such as being able to take the SAT or ACT in a low distraction environment. Some different options that are available in terms of higher education are vocational and technical schools, community college, traditional public and private four-year colleges, as well as considering being a full-time versus a part-time student. So these are all some kind of traditional options that are available in terms of higher education. And again, what you want to focus on is what's the best fit or the best match for the young adult in terms of their interests and skills, as well as supports that they need. Some considerations that you want to make specifically related to academics. If you're considering a traditional college, it's important to research if there's any specific academic requirements during your planning process. So are there any math, science, and language requirements or requirements for a particular program that the student is interested in applying to? Is there a foreign language requirement? And how can we plan ahead for these? Consider what level of academic preparedness is needed. And you also want to think about what supports have been provided so far academically, and can we provide this level of support in the college environment? Some things you want to consider in general when selecting a school are things like the size of the school, the location. Do you want it to be close to home, close to resources? What are the living options? You might want to look into the living options on campus, living options off of campus. What programs and majors are offered, and do these match the individual's interests and skills? What the overall campus culture is like? What extracurricular options are available that might be of interest to the student, what financial aid is available, do they offer a good orientation to the college experience? And you definitely want to look into what requirements and documentation is required to obtain specific support services on the campus. You also want to look into whether or not the school provides specific services for students with autism. Some schools provide more general services for all students with different disabilities and learning differences. However, some schools provide specific services just for students that are on the autism spectrum. So you want to find out whether they have these, what they are. Sometimes they're things like support groups or mentoring programs. An example of this is at Texas State University. I worked there several years ago, and through conjunction with the Counseling Center and the Office of Disability Services, they ran a great support group for students with autism spectrum disorders that met every other week. It was just for them, and it was kind of an open format where they could connect with others, and important topics that were related to supporting them in success were provided. So many schools are offering more autism-specific services for their students, so you want to research those. You also want to look into any more general support services and what those are, such as a college experience class, different mentoring programs. You also want to see if there's different options for flexibility in terms of course requirements and things like that. So are there options for reduced course loads? Do they ever make graduation time adjustments? Do they offer any substitutions for different class requirements? And in terms of educational accommodations, the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504, helps provide support for schools that receive federal funding, as well as the Americans with Disabilities Act also helps support accommodations for schools that might not receive federal funding. Coordination for academic accommodations is typically through the Office of Disability Services on campus. A lot of times, or not a lot of times, all the time, documentation is needed for eligibility for services. And if disability is clearly indicated, some accommodations that the student might have access to are things like note-taking support, books on tape, extended time on tests, basically different accommodations that are identified that might help support best outcome for the student. And again, it's important to remember that the student in college or higher education has increased responsibility to access the services available and use different accommodations that they're granted. And this needs to be taught during that transition planning process so they're aware of how to self-advocate for these. Some different offices that can provide support on higher education campuses are, again, the Office of Disability Services. Counseling centers can also be a great source of support. They provide a lot of helpful education on important topics, including everything from study skills to anxiety management. Most counseling centers offer both individual and group counseling, and some even have specific support groups. They might even offer an autism spectrum support group. The Career Resource Office on many campuses can be a great source of support for career exploration, as well as finding jobs. Many schools offer tutoring and support labs, and again, they might even offer more specialized services for students with autism. In terms of disclosure of, whether or not a student wants to disclose that they have autism, many parents and individuals wonder, do I need to make this known when I'm applying to college? This is definitely a personal choice, and the specific college application cannot ask about particular disabilities. Some individuals choose to include disclosing that they have autism in maybe their essays or letters of recommendation. For example, if they want to explain maybe there was a big disparity in grades, and they can talk about how some struggles that they experienced related to autism might have impacted their grades and include that in their essays. But again, it's a personal choice, and some students and families choose to disclose and some don't. The one necessary time that a disability must be disclosed is if the individual is seeking academic accommodations. Certain documentation will be necessary in order for them to be eligible for that. So let's move on to talking specifically about job and vocational related issues. There's particular factors that can support successful transition into jobs, and some of these are tailored instruction, tailored supports to the individual, behavior management, generalization of work-related skills to the real world, as well as vocational support services. So all of these factors can help set up the individual for success in terms of transitioning to employment. Again, during the transition planning process, you want to be proactive in planning for the transition to employment. The following things should be included during that planning process to support the young adult. You want to work on education on different jobs and career paths for the individual. It's important to include internship or volunteer experiences. Work-study programs are great so that the student can gain exposure to a variety of different jobs and kind of get a sense of what they might be interested in and what might be the best match for them. It's also important to include education on how to do a job search, finding jobs, interviewing skills, and applications. It's also helpful to explore transportation options that might be used to and from work, and in the planning process, helping the young adult get used to the transportation that they might need to use and learning that. It's good to identify different school-based vocational options if they're available in the individual's high school, again, such as internships or work-study programs. And during the planning process, it's also important to do some research into your state and what local agencies, such as vocational rehabilitation, are available and what eligibility is needed for those. As we've talked in terms of all of the broad areas of skills that are important for transitions, it's helpful to start with assessment as part of the planning process and to do this before the individual transitions to employment. So the examples of assessments that I discussed in terms of higher education are also helpful in terms of exploring factors and skills that can help with the transition process to employment. So again, as I mentioned earlier, the strong interest inventory and the Campbell Interest and Skills Survey can get a great sense of what the individual's interests are and what their skills are, and can give you important information for finding a best match for employment. The Break-In Transition Skills Inventory, as I mentioned earlier, is more of a general transition inventory, but it would also provide some helpful data that could be helpful for pre-employment. And then, of course, you can gather information from teachers, from parents, and from observation of the student or internship supervisors, for example, as part of that assessment process. So these areas we've discussed previously when we've talked about higher education and independent living, but some important areas that you want to consider are the individual's communication skills and challenges, social skills and challenges, executive functioning. Motor planning can be important for different particular jobs. Transportation knowledge, knowledge of basic finances, such as understanding their paycheck. Self-advocacy, how comfortable is the student in terms of asking questions and speaking up when they need to. Application, job search, and interviewing skills are important to consider. What are the individual's coping skills? How is their level of stress management? If they are going to face high levels of stress on the job, how do they usually cope? And do we need to teach more coping skills? Do they have any challenging behaviors, such as any rituals or compulsive behaviors that could impact their work performance? Or are there any sensory sensitivities that they might need certain accommodations for in the workplace? Um, in terms of teaching vocational skills and supporting them, um, specific skills for a very particular job can be supported and learned once that specific job is started. So it's not like you have to teach everything related to a specific job, but you want to work on general skills that will help set up the individual for success in the workplace. And you also want to consider, with the right supports, will the student be able to learn the specific job related skills? So once you've gathered all of the data, you've considered the unique needs of the adolescent or young adult, you've considered the overall transition plan, you want to create a general support plan for supporting and teaching vocational skills and determining what accommodations and specific supports are needed. When we're thinking about teaching specific vocational related skills, these are some different strategies. I've reviewed most of these in the social transition section, which we covered last time, as well as the independent living skills portion of this webinar series. So some of these will be familiar to you, but these are all teaching strategies that can be very useful for individuals with autism. So you might want to include some direct instruction. This is more lecture-based teaching, so going through a particular lesson on a job-related skill or a social skill that might be related to employment. Modeling can be very useful. This might be in-person modeling, so modeling an interview and interview skills, or you could use video modeling and present a video of a successful interview. You might use different self-monitoring strategies for vocational skills. So you might set up a self-checklist that the individual might use in the workplace where they have specific goals for the day and they check off as they complete those goals. Role play is also very useful. You might role play an interview or role play asking a boss a question. Social stories can also be great. Again, these are more kind of picture schedules that can help depict different social scenarios and provide a visual of how a scenario might take place and different related steps to that. Visual aids are also a great technique or strategy to use for employment success. So using visuals such as a visual schedule, a visual of workplace rules. You might even have pictures of the individual's co-workers with their names next to them to help them remember everyone's names. You might even have a map of the workplace if needed. Visuals can be a great teaching support. And also the use of technology can be helpful. Most of our phones have calendars on them. You can add in reminders, and there can be a lot of different tools that can be used to help support the individual in the workplace. In terms of teaching different vocational related skills, it's really helpful that the student gets to practice the skills in real life settings. So this might be during internships or work study programs in high school, job shadowing, summer jobs, anything that will help give them some real life exposure to the job environment, as well as help generalize some of the skills that they're learning to more real work environments. So typically, when we're teaching vocational skills, you're likely to use a combination of different methods, and the teaching support can be provided by a variety of different people, such as a therapist, a mentor, or a job coach. A lot of times workplace accommodations or modifications can be really helpful for individuals on the autism spectrum and helping set them up for success. So you might provide a quiet work environment free from loud noises or bright lights if there's any sensory sensitivities. Using visual aids such as a weekly schedule or a map of the workplace. Providing self-monitoring aids such as daily checklists to be completed. Providing extra support from a supervisor or coworker that works closely with the individual. Providing any coworker education as is necessary or comfortable for the individual. Providing added structure or added prompts for any changes in schedule that might kind of throw off the individual or create anxiety. Or even providing a private place or time if the individual does have compulsive or ritualized behaviors that are difficult for them to manage during the workday. They might have a specific time or a place that they can go to complete these and help manage them. And special interests can be incorporated, and this is important. So matching job requirements and duties with the individual's special interests. Different verticals. So I'm going to walk us through some of these. Supported employment is typically provided by vocational rehabilitation or another similar center agency. There's different models of supported employment. Typically, there's someone called an employment specialist or a job coach that helps walk the individual through and support them in planning for employment, and then once they do have employment, they help coordinate support to help the individual reach their vocational goals. They typically do assessments of what the individual's needs are, what supports they need. They can help the individual locate potential job matches, support with the application process, and then kind of provide on-the-job support and see whether or not it seems to be a successful match. And then typically the level of support is kind of faded out as is necessary. Some other types of supports or vocational supports, there are different residential and post-secondary education programs out there. Typically these are private programs. Some examples are the college internship program and the college living experience. These both provide both higher education support as well as they typically provide career and employment support as well. The caveat to these is that sometimes the price is pretty high. It might not be affordable for some families. Different agencies that can provide that often provide vocational support are Easter Seals and the ARC. There's also day programs that can provide more pre-employment type support. Same thing with sheltered workshops. These typically provide more training in developing life skills and pre-employment skills. There's a model called customized employment, which is basically kind of creatively piecing together and finding a good job match with the individual's interests and kind of negotiating with companies in terms of what duties the individual will have and how they can kind of create a job that will match what the individual's skills are as well as their interests. I put a quick link here to a video. I don't think I'm going to have time to show a video. I might at the end. But this was just a brief clip that I came across that I liked that shows a young adult's experience, and his supervisor talks about different accommodations that they made and how that led to him having some employment success. This was a video from the Autism Society of America Brooklyn chapter, and here's a link right here. I'd like to spend some time going through some resources and references that can be helpful with the transition process in general, as well as higher education and employment support. Parts of this webinar series, so I'm not going to spend as much time going through all of them, but I will kind of point out some that are related specifically to the topics we talked about today. But all of these links here, I'll hold that up there for a moment. Transition and vocation planning process. There's provides one of the books that I really like is this this related to transitions, and it's a great reference. It provides specifically on that was created by the Autism Society of Oakland chapter. Information on colleges that provide specific support for students with autism. I will say I'm not sure how often the list is updated. Oops. Okay. It's a guide specifically for secondary education, transitions of students with disabilities to post-secondary education. These are that relate to job support. One is on the job by Rudy Simone, and the second one is the hidden curriculum of getting and keeping a job by Brenda Smith Miles and Dallin Mayfield. These are both books that I've used as part of a job support program. Sounds like we might be having some technical issues with the sound. I'm going to try just disconnecting my headset real quick and Okay, I hope that helped. It looks like I have time for a few more questions. This next question states, students that have been on a modified plan are not eligible for college. What options are available for college education for these individuals? Um, if I'm understanding the question right, I think it's asking what are some alternatives for a traditional college experience for individuals who might not be the best fit for. Um, so some things that might be explored are things like more of a technical or vocational program. Um, Depending on the level of functioning and the match of the individual, um, you know, college might not be the best fit, and doing a program that might be more vocational in nature could be a better fit, as well as exploring different non-traditional type higher education options, or going to school part-time, community college. Again, it's going to be based on the individual and what their level of functioning is. So it's hard for me to answer that question very specifically, but you would want to look into alternatives to the traditional four-year college, again, such as vocational or technical school, a part-time program, community college, or exploring and moving into more vocational type options or day programs, kind of again depending on what the individual is functioning and what would be the best fit in terms of the supports that they need. And it looks like the last question we have time for, what kinds of documentation are required for the college to receive services? This is going to vary